you were young and your parents got you one of those cheap reel-to-reel tape recorders? Maybe the first thing you did after hearing your voice come out of a little speaker was to reverse the tape so that the voice came out backwards, and you could sound like a demon. Maybe you slowed the machine down or
sped it up so you could sound like a Martian.
If your machine was slightly sophisticated, you may even have been able to get a little spacey echo. At the time, you probably weren't aware that you were doing some of the same experiments as the early musicians working in musique concrète, or tape music. The same experiments as one of the founders of the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center, Otto Luening. Otto Luening's birth in 1900 coincided with the inventions of the first electronic instruments, including the singing arc and Thaddeus Cahill's telharmonium, also known as the dynamophone. These were the early seeds of electronic music that were planted in Otto Luening's mind.
There were, of course, the very early experiments of Cahill, Thaddeus Cahill. They were not so much composition as the demonstration of that machine of his, the dynamophone. Well, that went way back to 1906 or 7. And the interesting thing about that was that it was done at Mount Holyoke and created an enormous sensation around the country. And in all the magazines at that time, you had magazines, you didn't have broadcasts or things. So on the magazines, I remember in the farm in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, my father having this big collection of stuff saying about there's a new instrument that makes music electrically, and this will change the whole shape of music because you could get music will be sent by wire into the smallest villages and so on. There was great excitement in our family. We were all rather musical, and I had one brother was an engineer at MIT, so we began fooling around with adjusting phonographs and sticking pillows into the horns and slowing up the speed and trying to make the records fool around. It didn't last very long. It lasted a couple of weeks, and then it sort of died out.
Totally Wired, Artists in Electronic Sound. The music of yesterday may never be the same. The music of tomorrow may be sounds we've never heard. We live in an electronic world. These are the sound shapers of our era. Totally Wired.
It's a long way from the turn-of-the-century farm in Wisconsin to the state-of-the-art electronic music studios of Columbia-Princeton. In between, Luening's interest in electronic music was rekindled by his mentor, Ferruccio Busoni. Luening studied with the famous pianist and composer after 1917 in Europe. Though Busoni never performed any electronic music, he saw its potential and inspired his students, including Edgar Varese, with its possibilities.
Oddly enough, Ferruccio Busoni, with whom I studied, read this article, one of these articles about Cahill, and he mentioned it in a little book that he'd written called A New Aesthetic of Music. And in that book he said, well, now I have this news from America that a man has made a machine where he can measure sound even by the vibrations. And he said, this is probably going to open up the doors and give us new horizons and much needed horizons for music in the future, because he said we can't go on imitating Wagner and Brahms. That was Busoni's point of view.
The 200-ton monstrosity that was Cahill's telharmonium never worked out as a practical instrument. So despite these influences, Luening went on for another 30 years as a conventional composer and conductor. But World War II brought some changes in technology in the American worldview. The atomic bomb altered the landscape of global relationships as well as Hiroshima, but the magnetic tape recorder, perfected by the Germans during the war, changed the shape of all music made after its creation. It was Vladimir Usichevsky, a pianist and student of Luening's at Columbia University, who introduced him to the tape recorder as a musical device.
Then I think it was in 51, he had a composer's forum of his own things. And he had, by that time, the tape recorder had come over here, and the department had bought one, and he was able to begin to fool around with it, which he did, just experiments. So Usichevsky cooked up some experiments that he included in this composer's forum. which was received with interest. And they said, well, this is a long kind of a road, but we wish him well, that he won't break his neck. And I was at the time director of the Bennington, Vermont Composers Conference. So I immediately thought, at once when I saw this tape recorder moving in, I thought, this is for me, because I'd done a lot of stuff along the road, studies in acoustics and in experimenting of various kinds, but we didn't have the instruments to do anything with, really. So I invited him to come up to Bennington to the Composers Conference, and I said, come on up, and we can get a place there, and let's experiment and see what this stuff is, And so he did. He had, at the time, a little equipment that went in the seat of his car. And he brought that up there, and then we really got going, did a lot of experimenting up there. We tested out different instruments and made modifications, primitive ones of speed variation and various other ways of mixing the material and getting different results.
While Luening and Ussachevsky were woodshedding in Vermont, the French and Germans were also exploring similar areas. Pierre Schaeffer, Pierre Henry, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen were discarding traditional music almost completely and began recording sounds from nature and factories and manipulating them on tape. But Luening and Ussachevsky took a more balanced approach, perhaps reflecting the fact that they didn't have the historical rupture of World War II and Nazism in their backyard. Also, Luening was 51 years old and had the bulk of his life invested in the traditions of music. He wasn't so willing to toss it all aside.
Ussachevsky and I, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, wanted to extend the resonance of existing instruments to start with. Now, that would tie it in with, that would be an evolutionary movement from the music of the past into the music of the future. Some of the revolutionary ones were those who simply said, well, you've got to work with the machines directly and take even ideas from the machines and not try to tie it in with anything. In fact, let the past go. Then they quote Nietzsche, God is dead. Nothing new. Nietzsche thought it up a long time ago. And a lot of them thought they had invented music, Now we can get someplace because we've invented music. It's a question, though, if you get something that new and that different, if it could be recognized by people.
Perhaps Luening and Ussachevsky weren't as far from tradition as this piece by Pierre Schaeffer, Symphonie pour un homme seul, yet they brought entirely new concepts of sound shaping to music. The use of tape recorders played with time itself. They could produce a note in one instant, change it in the next, actually hearing it in a later moment and running it backwards through time again to the beginning. Their ideas became standard techniques for many producers and musicians, such as George Martin and the Beatles with the LP Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. They brought the hitherto avant-garde concepts of music made and treated in the studio to popular acceptance. Devices called signal processors were made to get the effects that Luening and Ussachevsky were generating on tape. Flangers, phase shifters, wah-wah pedals, fuzz boxes, and echoplexes all have their genesis in the tape machines and studios of composers such as Otto Luening and Vladimir Ussachevsky.
We decided we'd work on our own instruments to start, the flute, which I play, and the piano he plays, and see what we can do there, you see, in modifying those sounds. Another thing that we did, partially because we didn't have the equipment, was to work with existing instruments as sound sources for the most part, but try to extend the resonance of existing instruments. And I'm glad to say that that survived, that whole business of having a clarinet as a sound source, or a bassoon, or what have you, and then modifying that and changing those sounds. That still goes on quite a bit with the present day people. Well, that we did right at the beginning. It's a long time ago now, 51, 2.
In 1951, no one knew where it was going, and even Luening wasn't sure if it should be taken seriously.
We played those at a cocktail party for the other composers, just as entertainment, just for the fun of it. And when it was over, a lot of these guys came up to us, some of them like Roger Gibb, who became quite prominent afterwards, Lionel Novak and some others, and in a rather solemn-faced way, they congratulated us and said, congratulations. And we said, well, it was a lot of fun. They said, oh no, they said, this is really, you've hit a new horizon in music. And we said, well, I know, but, and they said, well, it's the beginning, but it's the beginning of something extremely important. And so this was the reception at that party. And we said, oh, come on, let's get on with the party. But it wasn't long before we had a telephone call from New York. It was from Oliver Daniel, who was managing the Stokowski BMI concert at the Modern Museum. And he said Stokowski asked, and he had suggested that we do some short pieces for him to include, to introduce this new medium, tape music, on his concert. But we didn't want to do it because we had no equipment, you see. We had just this traveling stuff that we carried up with I think we had 2 tape recorders and a little thing that Mosaic built for a reverberation box. It was a very nice little gadget, but that was about it, plus our imaginations and the flute and Ussachevsky's ability to play piano. So we weren't too anxious to get into that, but they insisted on this and said, oh, come on, you can do something. short. So finally we agreed, and then we went up to this farm that Henry Cowell had near Woodstock in Shady, New York, and Cowell helped us set up a little homemade studio in this farmhouse where we sound deadened with rugs and things and borrowed loudspeakers from around the countryside, and then got going on these things. And I did the first three pieces with the flute as a sound source, the one called Fantasy in Space, which is done all over the place now, and the other one, Low Speed, that's also gets around a lot, and then one, an Invention with 12 tones. Those were my three, and Yusachevsky did one called Sonic Contours, which he used the piano as a sound source. And that was how these first pieces got done.
Obviously, there was little glamour in the early days. What limited equipment existed was makeshift and primitive. In our present era of microprocessors, video games, and home computers that fit in a suitcase, it's hard to imagine just how cumbersome and crude things were only 30 years ago. Rather than working in a gleaming high-tech environment, it all had the aura of a clandestine underground movement.
Now, we couldn't stay there forever. Then we moved here to town, and the laboratory, this moving laboratory, went into the living room at Yusachevsky's. And then eventually we got into trouble with the neighbors, and also the place got all full of wires and equipment. It was a little hard for Aunt Betty Yusachevsky. It was a big job to drag that around. We had no help, you see. We used to have to carry the stuff. That's how I got my battle scar of a nice hernia that I have, which I got from carrying this heavy Ampexes afterwards. We'd borrow equipment a lot because we didn't own any. And we used to spend a great deal of time, this was very funny, David Sarcer, who was Toscanini's sound man, he made all of the recordings for Toscanini. He had a sound studio up in the maestro's house in Riverdale, in the basement of the house. So he would take us up there at night when the maestro was out of town, and we'd go down in the basement of Toscanini's house, and there we checked our stuff and did a lot of work getting these pieces in shape for the Stokowski concert. But we found out early in the game that it's really not the expense of the equipment, but it's the extent of your imagination that carries you through.
Eventually, Luening and Yusachevsky teamed up with fellow composer Milton Babbitt from Princeton and obtained funds and space to form the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. Founded in 1959, it proved to be one of the most renowned sources of electronic music. But even this support did not carry them out of the technological dark ages of electronic music equipment. Most of their instruments were originally designed for other purposes and were adapted to musical ends.
The first thing, we had the usual, what they call a classical equipment of tape recorders and oscillators and frequency changers. And then we got the big RCA sound synthesizer that they first rented to us. They wouldn't give it to us, but they had built this big machine. It was an elaborate business, Bilar Olson machine. And then they found out that I think they thought they could restore old classical records and pop music and so on, but then they found that their people, it was more difficult to run this thing than they had anticipated. So they rented it to us, but finally they gave it to us on indefinite loan. And we had that. Babbitt was very virtuoso at using that instrument.
Whenever there is a new technological development, there are controversies. For every breakthrough that gives us a television set or jet transportation, there is the specter of automation, electronic surveillance, or Sputnik. People want to know if it is dehumanizing or unnatural. Perhaps if God had wanted us to make electronic music, we would have been born with oscillators. As a pioneer, Otto Luening was among the first to grapple with these questions and come to terms with this new interface between humans and machines.
The reception of that first concert at the Modern Museum was set the stage for what's still happening, because about half the audience thought that this was the greatest thing that's happened since the invention of counterpoint, and the other half thought that we were ruining music. You see, the performers would go out of business, and they'd all be a mechanized kind of music making and so on. Well, actually, there are two schools of thought, or maybe even more, in the whole area of electronic and computer music. I think that there are some who are more engineer-minded, who really have a secret wish that they could sort of have self-guided music, like self-guided missiles and all of those things, that somehow they could just turn the crank and get their symphony, and that anybody could do it. One engineer told me one time he's going to work until he's got a machine so that if the tired plumber comes home at night, he can make his own music. And my comment always was on that. I used it as a foil in a lot of talks. I said, and he would make his own music, and it would sound like the music of a tired plumber who came home at night, late at night, which is all right too, but I don't expect him to necessarily go through the Diabelli variations with me before he fixes my toilet.
Electronic music had a liberating effect on many composers. Theoretically, they could have total control over the final outcome of their compositions and wouldn't have to subject them to second-hand interpretations by conductors and musicians. But people were accustomed to seeing and hearing their music in live performances. Seeing an electronic composer walk on stage, switch on a tape deck, and leave the stage as the disembodied music came from the loudspeakers had a tendency to leave audiences cold. No matter how much time, energy, emotion, and painstaking care went into putting a piece together in the studio, the audience still missed the human element of sweat. For this reason, many of Luening's compositions entail live performers.
The degree of control that you want to have, you can select. It can be absolute if you go and program it on a computer, or you do certain things with a synthesizer and so on. You can get down exactly what you want, and there it is, like a picture, like a photograph. It's that aspect of your musical personality. It takes out the subjective contribution of the performer, which is something that I've never wanted removed. I like to have the performer have his own subjective relationship. So what I've done in a couple of cases, I've written, for instance, my gargoyles for violin and tape recorder. The violinist has quite a sense of freedom. He's man, and the tape recorder is the machine. Tape recorder knocks it off right precisely and in great snappy fashion. But the performer, the live performer who plays a duet with it, still makes his subjective comment. Now, there are many people who don't want subjective comment anymore. It's too painful for them. I mean, we get into all of these things about maybe the world of feeling, the world of emotion, and a lot of people think that those emotions in that whole world should be moved, possibly by an operation of some kind, to remove the center of emotions so that people won't be troubled by sadness and joy and pleasures and whimsy and humor, and unless it's of a sick variety, that's all right. But I have also a very funny, strange feeling about music, and that is that I wonder if music doesn't have to be flexible enough to stand a considerable amount of subjective manhandling, and that otherwise, the reason that Beethoven, for instance, has been a composer who's lasted is because he's withstood the many lousy performances of his music that have taken place since he wrote it.
Otto Luening's earliest electronic composition is little more than 30 years old, so time has yet to make a decision about its longevity. But the influence he has had on music during that time has been profound, whether one is aware of his work or not. Otto Luening has managed to come to terms with modern technology and bent it to make a music that is warm and very human. In the next segment of Totally Wired, Wendy Carlos of Switched On Bach fame realizes all electronic symphonies in The Synthesized Orchestra, Part 1.
Totally Wired, Artists in Electronic Sound, was produced by John DiLiberto and Kimberly Haas for radio station WXPN in Philadelphia. Funding was provided by Sequential Circuits Incorporated, makers of electronic keyboard instruments, Yamaha Corporation, makers of electronic and acoustic instruments, the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts.